Welcome to this edition of the Capitol Notebook. I'm Mike Friesen. With us for our program today, Assemblyman Brian Kolb. Brian Kolb is the minority leader of the New York State Assembly. He also represents an assembly district in the Finger Lakes in upstate New York, representing both Ontario and Seneca counties. We want to thank you folks across New York State for joining us. Assemblyman Kolb, it has been a busy place here in Albany since the last time you were here for one of these programs a couple of weeks ago.
Well, busy, it's true. Not necessarily busy with the things I'd like to see all the time, but certainly it has been a very active 2013.
We are obviously going to get your reaction to the recently enacted New York State budget and all that it means for the people of New York State, what kind of impact, what kind of direction you see this budget moving this state in. That's coming up in just a couple minutes. But first, let me ask you about what's been making big headlines here over the past week or so at the state capitol, and that is the arrest of 3 members of the New York State legislature, 1 state senator, 2 of your colleagues in the state assembly, on corruption charges, charges involving bribery, selling their position, if you will, to curry favor on issues facing the state legislature. That's got to be disappointing to you.
Well, it's disappointing, and it's an embarrassment, and it's a smear on the institution and a lot of good people, men and women, that have served the legislature. Unfortunately, this is the type of thing that makes news that's not good news, and it hurts public confidence, public erosion of confidence in state government, and that's not good for anybody, and it just only further diminishes a reputation that in general people don't think very highly of their elected officials, unfortunately, whether it's in Albany or Washington, and we've got to do some things to try to make it even tougher for people to break the law.
Yeah, I remember you always used to hear about politicians in Albany being compared rather equally to maybe a used car salesman or something of that sort. Something that, you have episodes like this, it's not going to change that perception.
Well, no, but certainly I think one of the things is that, as I've talked to different constituents and different media outlets about this, is that one thing, though, that anybody that has broken the law, and these legislators will be no different, as well as some people in New York City and New York City councilmen, that any legislator that's been caught, charged, and then convicted has been punished. So it's not like people are getting away with anything. It's just that people try to get away with things. And, in our society, we have the toughest, some of the toughest drug laws. People still sell and buy drugs and use drugs. We have the toughest DWI laws. People still get behind the wheel of a car and get arrested for DWI. Law, if you got bad people, it doesn't matter how strong the law is. If people want to try to break the law or to try to enrich themselves in some form or fashion, they're going to try it if they've just got bad behavior in their DNA.
Apparently, some of the press releases on these arrests quote one of the members of Assembly is saying something like, well, everybody's doing it, and everybody could end up getting arrested in Albany for this type of behavior. Everybody's doing it. That's got to hurt some.
Well, that's an outright lie. I mean, because they're not. It's not a rampant problem. We've had people over the last decade. We've had, I think, about a dozen legislators, I think, mostly legislators that come from New York City. And that's not to say that there aren't folks that have had some issues outside of New York City, but it's predominantly legislators, Democrat legislators from New York City. And part of that is we believe that there's just not ample competition in New York City. We had an assembly member not too long ago that actually had to leave office because he broke the law, filed false travel forms, got reimbursed for expenditures he did not make, and the following fall, his voters in his district sent him back to Albany. And unfortunately, in the New York City market, and this is an unfortunate statement I'm going to make, but it's true, is that some of these legislators are reelected on a badge of honor. You've got Congressman Charlie Rangel, who broke ethics law, broke tax violations, yet his voters sent him back to Washington. So this is some of the frustrating part when you're dealing with some of these subject matters, and I think that's why we have to have a much higher standard for all elected officials, and because eventually we have to send a message that that behavior is not welcome.
I wonder if maybe there's not something wrong with society too when an elected official, a disgraced congressman who sent pictures, some pretty strange pictures to someone, has decided, well, maybe I still can run for mayor of New York City and maybe everything will be okay and that won't be held against me. To me, that just boggles my mind.
Well, I think it boggles the minds of most average New Yorkers, and I think Congressman Weiner should not run for office again. I don't think Elliot Spitzer should run for office again, but they can't help themselves dream dreams that people will send them back to office and forgive their transgressions. I can tell you this, is that being an upstate legislator, if any of these things happened to me, I'd be out of office and I would never return to office because the voters wouldn't have anything of it.
That makes for an interesting distinction then in that conversation we have all the time about the differences, the diversity of upstate versus downstate New York and the way it comes into play. That might be a perfect example of just how strange and different the perceptions are in downstaters and upstaters when it comes to the issues facing the state.
Well, and we're going to be having more dialogue about that. We're looking at legislation to toughen up a lot of aspects of campaign finance and all sorts of things, and so hopefully as the coming weeks we'll have a good package to try to tighten that noose a little bit.
On to the New York State budget discussion that we need to have here, because this state budget, of course, impacts all New Yorkers, all you folks that are watching this program who are residents of the Empire State. You will see some kind of impact on your life, on your pocketbook because of this budget. Let's start off this discussion by going back a little bit to one of the meetings you had of what's known here in Albany as the General Conference Committee, made up of all the state legislative leaders who were meeting together to talk about this process as it was taking place. You voiced some of your opinions on what you hoped would be included in this budget, and then we can find out just how your wish list made out. To the tape, and then we'll be back to talk more today with Brian Kolb.
But certainly as we're sorting out those pots of money and where they're going to go, we would certainly encourage additional money to go to the CHIPS program and for local control, not controlled by the regional economic development councils. Certainly we have a lot to talk about with workers' compensation and the state insurance fund. In terms of school aid, again, we would like to see a priority given to the gap elimination process and funding formula and focus on the high and average needs school districts that need our help. Certainly when we talk about school safety, I'd like to see us within the budget framework find help and funding for school resource officers for those schools that do not have school resource officers in our state. Mandate relief certainly is an ongoing topic, but certainly one of those proposals that the governor had put forth on having local decision-making on sales tax extenders. I would agree with that, and we agree with that, to try to lower local government costs in terms of processing these extenders.
Let me pick out a couple of those items for you to react to, and that's how'd you do on the school aid and how'd you do on the local roads, those CHIPS programs?
Well, those two particular subjects we did well on, and we had asked for $100 million in additional help for the CHIPS program, which is local roads and bridges, and we got $75 million. That was not sent through the regional economic development councils, which is a good thing. And certainly we had more money directed to the high needs and average needs school districts throughout the state by a significant amount of money. So I would say to you that certainly the progress was made on both fronts, and as we'll talk about with anything else, is that you hope for a lot more positive things come out of a budget, and there were, such as school aid, CHIPS funding, and other agencies. But then on the flip side, some of the negatives were certainly the developmental disabled cuts in spending, which was a real problem, I think, statewide.
The other thing you mentioned at the end of your remarks, there was mandate relief. That has been a tough nut to crack here the last few years. You've said all along that that's the one thing you think could give huge overall relief to local governments, whether it's school districts, counties, towns, villages, cities. Was any of that included in this budget?
Not from a significant perspective, Mike, and that was a disappointment on unfunded mandate relief. Certainly we were pushing for an acceleration of Medicaid Medicaid costs to be not passed down to the counties and cap it now, but that's still in the phase-out program. I think if you talk to most organizations, municipalities, county governments, even school districts that are still short on mandate relief. And that was one of the things that we talked about specifically, was in terms of having the school districts have the mandate of teacher evaluation testing or review, that process, to be paid for by the state, because that was a demand coming from the state, and needless to say, that didn't happen.
One other issue that you spoke on as this budget process was going on here in Albany was something that could provide relief to utility customers across this state, and that is what's known as, here in Albany parlance, as the 18A utility tax assessment. Let's take a look at some of the remarks Brian Kolb made at that press conference here at the state capitol, and then again we'll come back and see if there was any relief on that front included in this budget package.
This is clearly and purely a revenue source that has been tacked upon the consumers and businesses of our state for the last 5 years. And as it's like everything else in Albany, you know, we say it's going to sunset, then all of a sudden magically we start to talk about maybe continuing on a tax. And I know there's other areas that are starting to hit the press right now in terms of revenue sources. And really, again, one of the things we've always tried to focus in our proposals as a conference is what can we do to actually shrink the size and cost of state government. Instead of continually to look for revenue sources, what can we do to bring in the cost of Medicaid, the largest cost program in the entire country? What can we do to further consolidate state agencies to, again, lower costs, like consolidating the Thruway Authority and the Department of Transportation? So this isn't, you know, we have always tried to offer public policy ideas and solutions to live within our means, and certainly also to promote public policies that will help encourage businesses and families to stay here, rather than looking at one more reason to maybe not stay here.
A lot of people may not really fully understand what the 18A assessment is, but it's something that shows up on everybody's utility bill, whether you're just a residential customer or a business customer.
Absolutely, and it's very clear to find because it says New York State charge on there, and that's the only New York State charge on there, and the utilities clearly put it on there because they don't want to be blamed for that tax that we're all paying. So anybody that's paying a utility bill, whether you live in an apartment, a home, a business, we've been paying that tax for the last 5 years. Statewide, it costs $500 million, and it was supposed to sunset, which means end. And in this particular budget, they decided to continue it, although they're planning on phasing it out over 5 years. But it's still a continuation of hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes that all of us are paying every month on our electric bill and our gas bill, or both if you happen to have both.
If I remember correctly, you told me this really amounted just to a general fundraiser on the part of the state, a way to make money, kind of a way to hide it there too. But from what you're telling me, this is going to be coming to an end, just not immediately.
That's correct. Well, hopefully it's going to come to an end, but as Albany's, this whole thing was supposed to come to an end this year, but obviously it didn't.
So in our last couple of minutes, if you feel positive about this budget, I mean, I understand there's things in there you really like, things in there you didn't like, but is this budget moving New York State in the direction that you think it should be headed?
Ultimately, right now, no. I still think when you net it all out, taxes still went up. The size of the spending growth was smaller, but I have to tell you, Mike, there's still a tremendous amount of waste of money that's being spent. And we put a $350 rebate in there that was only going to help some people in the state, not everybody. My philosophy is you shouldn't take the money in the first place and then turn around and give it in a rebate to a certain group of people, so they already picked winners and losers with this thing, and they're going to send those checks out during an election year. I think that is just awful public policy, and like I said, there are some good things we did for local highways and good things we did for some school districts, but certainly we got a long way to go before this budget really sets us on the right path.